to your question of can people use Tornado Cash now? And I think that is a fairly nuanced question. And I think one that we don't really know exactly yet.
Welcome back to a very unique and special episode of Coordinated. So the listeners of this episode are mainly Eigendebs, Eigennerds, and CP geeks. And mostly we talk about technology, infrastructure, how you can use Eigenlayer and stuff. But today is a little different episode. We'll mostly deep dive into policy stuff, which we did an episode with Nikhil, I think a couple of months back, where he demonstrated what Predicate is and the unique innovation of policy engine and how Eigenlayer is enabling that. But today let's discuss with from a different angle of how the latest Tornado Cash sanction which been lifted up. We'll have a round of discussions around that. Jane has joined Nikhil and Parth is host of me for this episode. Welcome Nikhil, welcome Jane. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Awesome. I think before we deep dive into the thread which Nikhil wrote, which kind of sparked up all this conversation, Nikhil, if you can give us a quick intro, followed by Jane, if you can just walk you through your background and like where what you do at this moment.
Yeah, sure. I can start. Nikhil, co-founder and CEO of Predicate. Thanks for having me again. Predicate is policy infrastructure. We enable any developer, organization, project, ecosystem, build pre-transaction policies for what can go through their smart contract, their solver network, their sequencer, really anything on chain. And our view really is that policy is critical infrastructure, that as blockchains scale into the global economy, you have to be able to enable policies for all these different applications to scale, because we're talking about the movement of money and finances across regulated and unregulated markets. So that's what we're doing with Predicate. We use Eigenlayer in the back end. We are an AVS that's built on Eigenlayer.
I'm Jane Khodorkovsky. I'm a partner at Arcturos. We are a boutique firm focused on financial integrity in the emergent technology space. So work with a lot of projects like Nikhil's. Prior to that, I was the general counsel of Cello Foundation and also spent most of my career prior to coming into the private sector as a state and federal prosecutor. I was the trial attorney in the money laundering and asset recovery section at the Department of Justice. So a lot of the issues we're going to be talking about today, I've spent a lot of time thinking about, both from the investigation and prosecution side, but now working with projects and thinking about the intersection of privacy and how the emergent technology works to minimize risk from money laundering and sanctions. So thanks so much for having us.
Awesome. I think let's dive straight into the topic of today's discussion, that is Tornado Cash. I think folks or the protocol is in trends in 2022, although they are, I think, in the building process in 2020, but they got real limelight. Like everybody in crypto, outside crypto, came to know about them after the US government sanctioned them in 2022. And since then, I think the protocol was banned, kind of. The founders and the developers were charged of multiple money laundering and other criminal offenses, if we say. And it was, I think, lots of discussions and lots of debates across Twitter, across all the big media platforms went up. Is code really a free speech? And why founders or developers who just deployed a platform, which is an open source code, got so much bashing or got so much punishment because of all those stuff. And I think at the present day, I think last week, the government, the US, the OFAC, they kind of removed the sanction from Tornado Cash smart contracts, if I'm being very specific. And that ignited lots of conversations. People started writing about in Twitter, hey, can we again use Tornado Cash? What's the status? How we can use it? And I think so much thing has happened. But before going deep into all those stuff, I think Nikhil or Jane, if anybody of you can take us to the course of action in a proper segment, like what happened, if you can give some context, what ignited that? Like suddenly government came in 2022 and sanctioned it. And then what happened between that era, like in the 3 years till today, and what again led the government to kind of remove the sanctions? at this moment? If you can take us to the time frame.
Sure. In the U.S., we have the Department of the Treasury, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which basically is one of the main departments within the U.S. government that has sanctions authorities. And one of the things that we saw happening, and we'll get to the Department of Justice as well, but in August of 2022, OFAC sanctioned for the first time the Immutable smart contracts, the website related to Tornado Cash, but they also sanctioned Roman Semyonov, who is one of the co-founders of Tornado Cash. And the sanctions that were imposed, obviously, as you mentioned, were really unique at the time because it was one of the first time that a mixing service, as the government looked at it, was being sanctioned, but that was immutable. And as you said, once code was released, the co-founders no longer had control of the protocol. And this was unique because any sanctions that were imposed prior to the sanctions in August of 22 against Tornado Cash were actually against entities or property or individuals or specific wallets that were tied to alleged criminal activity. Now, with respect to Tornado Cash, the reason why OFAC gave for these sanctions were related to the use of the protocol by a DPRK or the Lazarus Group, and they were tying it to certain large hacks like the Xfinity hack and others that had happened in the cryptocurrency sort of ecosystem. And so the Department of Treasury took these actions. Now, fast forward, if that wasn't enough, the Department of Justice's, the Southern District of New York, brought criminal charges against Roman Storm and Roman Semyonov, who were the co-founders of Tornado Cash. And in that indictment, which has not changed, and it's actually, and we'll get into this, is still scheduled for trial in July of this year in New York. The Department of Justice also brought pretty novel legal issues and legal arguments related to the founders running an unlicensed money transmitter under a certain statute, 18 USC 1960. And so when we saw what we saw over the course of the last few years is certain individuals and entities were challenging the Department of Treasury's authorities to sanction immutable smart contracts. And we saw that in two lawsuits that were filed on the civil side against the Department of the Treasury, one in the Fifth Circuit, which we'll touch on because the Department of the Treasury mentioned it specifically and sort of took these actions that we'll talk more about on Friday as a result of the decision in the Fifth Circuit. And then there was also a pending 11th Circuit decision. And so why was the Fifth Circuit decision so important from the courts? The courts found that the immutable smart contracts were not actually property under the law, which meant in their view, under this Fifth Circuit's view, the Department of the Treasury did not have authority to sanction smart contracts that were immutable because they were not property. Now, the caveat to this is the Fifth Circuit also told the Treasury, hey, you can go to Congress and ask for more authority, but you can't sanction it right now because you don't have these authorities. So fast forward to last Friday, the Department of the Treasury did, in fact, delist and remove the sanctions against Tornado Cash's website and all of the smart contracts. What the Department of Treasury did not do was they did not remove Roman Semyonov from the OFAC sanctions list, and they just redesignated him under the authorities they had and they have to sanction criminal or illicit actors under the North Korea sanctions regulations. And they also noted in their press release that they still find that, one, they removed it in their own sort of discretion. They didn't do it because they thought what they did was wrong or that they wouldn't do it again. But they did this in their own discretion, and they still find that North Korea and Lazarus pose a serious threat to the U.S. and to like the criminal activity that the Department of Treasury is trying to stop from happening. And so the reason this is really important is to your question of, can people use Tornado Cash now? And I think that is a fairly nuanced question. And I think one that we don't really know exactly yet what Treasury is thinking and will do, because the criminal case against Roman Storm is still moving forward in the Southern District of New York in July. And we don't have a really specific understanding from Treasury whether or not they will take any further steps against the mutable smart contracts related to Tornado Cash. So let me just stop there before we dig further in.
Yeah, I think for the listeners, I think if you can simplify one thing, what are immutable and mutable smart contracts? I think that will give us more context for the listeners to think about the differences about both the things.
Sure. Nikhil, do you want me to take it or do you want to do it? Okay.
Go for it.
An immutable smart contract is one that is not in the control anymore of the developer, that it has, it can't be upgraded, it can't be changed. It has been released. There's no control. And a lot of the conversations from a policy and a legal analysis perspective is who has control over these the computer code, right? Once it is released into the world and it's being used, and really at the crux of the issue and what has given a lot of us in the blockchain space, but more generally people in the developer and technology space, is if you're a developer and you've released code or you've developed computer code that others can use, and then some malicious actor who you didn't realize would be using it uses your technology, are you liable or should you be held accountable for a third party's actions, versus something that you do have control over and the government may feel like an immutable smart contract that you can change something about that to prevent illicit actors from using it. So there's this distinction around control that is really at the heart of the Treasury sanctions, but also the criminal case that was brought by the Department of Justice.
Cool. Jane, I think one thing which you highlighted from that, just want to know about a few things around that the government has kind of sanctioned the founders or the contributors or the people who have deployed the protocol. Whereas the protocols are kind of, the main Tornado Cash protocol has kind of removed from the charges which has been charged on it. In my little understanding, it should be the reverse case, because the people who have deployed the platform, right, and they have left it to the hands of people where you can do whatever you want. That is up to the people, right? It's like, I think many people have drawn the analogy, I'll again repeat it. Let's say I deploy Twitter, right? And if some stupid things or some hate speech is going on in Twitter, that's not, let's say, Jack Doss's responsibility. If, let's say, I'm still in the board, right? So government can't come and, like, this is my understanding, can't catch Jack and say, hey, you have deployed the thing. Although what I know, Twitter codes are all closed source, you can't see it. But for Tornado Cash thing, they have left it in the hands of people, and we know mixing a protocol has real utility also, right? Why such discrepancy, or is there something we need to know?
I can start on this one. So I think it starts getting a little messy when you start comparing it to social media platforms. There's actually a lot of other case history on that, on what is the role of a technology platform as a social media platform and the content that's put on there, and whether they're responsible or not. So there's been a lot of kind of prior cases that relates to like Facebook Meta, Twitter, and others. But in the case here of something like a Tornado Cash, yeah, you can deploy contracts, right? And so I think this is what the argument has been made by the crypto industry, is like, look, this is open source contracts that are deployed. And so the contracts themselves can't be sanctioned. It's just code. But I think you're starting to get to the heart of the matter of, if a developer deploys something, the question is do they know that they're facilitating something bad or not? So that intention does matter here, right? And so I can't simply say I'm going to do something bad, but, I did open source code, so it's fine. I haven't done anything wrong. And I think this is where it starts going into, from a developer standpoint, of what are you deploying? We are responsible for what we deploy, right? Like, we're always responsible for the actions that we take and what we end up doing. And so, yeah, you can have third parties using it. But I think this is where it starts going into when you start thinking about who is a developer, what was the intention? Did they know about something that might happen with this? Then are they putting precautions in place, knowing that certain things could happen? Or are they saying, oh, it's not my responsibility, or this isn't my problem, this is the world's problem, right? And so then intentionality and what you're doing actually does matter. So you are so responsible for what you do at the end of the day, from an individual and from a developer and from an organization standpoint.
I also think it's important to think about, from a developer's perspective, what are you trying to accomplish? Who are the users you're trying to reach? Really understanding when you're deploying certain code, or you're developing a protocol, or you're developing a decentralized application or a centralized application, whatever the case might be. What are the risk vectors, and trying to mitigate those in good faith, in a way that you're closing the doors, or you're minimizing the risk that a bad actor will use those, be able to use the technology that you put forth in the world. Where I do think the challenge with emergent technology, just like what we're talking about with open source blockchain technology, is where does the law draw the line, to Nikhil's point around intent? And what should we think about what are the limitations of the law when we are applying certain things like sanctions, right? To the point where the Fifth Circuit said, look, an immutable smart contract is not property. And if it's not property, I think the question then becomes whether or not there are different sort of standards or accountability or ways that we should hold developers accountable that don't go as far as saying, you're responsible for every third party, decades after something happened that has been deployed. I think where, the government, if I put my former government hat on, they will say, look, if you know that sanctioned actors like Lazarus Group and DPRK are using your technology, and there is a way for you to take risk mitigation steps, the government will always say you have to do it. Whether we philosophically may agree or not with that, that's different. And I think that's where we can debate. But I think that's where sort of the government's perspective is. They're not going to be okay with someone saying, people are laundering their money through this, or they're helping fund terrorism financing. That's really where the rubber is going to meet the road, where philosophical ideas around preservation of privacy, which is really, really important. And Nikhil and I talk a lot about this. I think it's really critical that individuals have privacy. And the idea with blockchain technology and decentralization is really to remove those intermediaries. But some of that is the law, has been built in many ways to address issues around sort of the intermediaries we're used to in the financial institutions or financial sector that we're. And so we're now getting to a point where the courts are being educated and understand that there's a difference between code that can be upgraded, or someone has an admin key, versus in this situation where Tornado Cash, the protocol, was fully, open source and available for anyone to use. And we can, spend a lot of time talking about like the intricacies of the technology, but there really is this fundamental difference about technology that's open to everyone to use, and whether or not it's appropriate to bring criminal charges or to levy sanctions against the founders who developed this code.
Yeah, also like keeping this in mind, what should then a developer, let's say, who's trying to build something around privacy protocol, let's say, what should he keep in mind while building something to avoid legal risks?
Yes, I can start on this one as well. So I think and then Jane, you should definitely provide input on this as a lawyer and former GC. in this case, I think, I mean, first one is actually from a developer standpoint, know that like what you are deploying, like there are ramifications and repercussions to that, right? So saying that you're not on the hook for something and trying to profit off of it, like I think there is a fundamental problem there. So if you're saying I'm going to build a protocol, I'm going to profit off of this, and if you have an idea that, oh yeah, this can be used by malicious actors from an exploit for sanctioned entities, for human trafficking, all of those things, that's still your responsibility, right? You can't go away from that responsibility. And so still having to think about that and noting that, especially if you're like, oh, I'm going to go and profit from this, that's something you have to think about. And so in that case, like, how are you actually building your code? How are you building your front end? If you're putting relayers or, intent-based systems, how are you facilitating those transactions? You're making a choice in all of those cases. And so just because, like a permissionless code that is, fully open source, you still deployed it, you still developed it, and you still, especially if you're planning to monetize around it. So I think from a developer standpoint, that matters a lot. You can't get away with it just because you're saying that the contracts are non-upgradable. I think the other part that's great is that there's actually a lot of tooling that's in place for, especially when it comes to privacy, to say, hey, look, we can actually address some of these problems, right? So some of the different privacy protocols are actually building tools around this, or they have implemented tools. And some of these are at the UI level, some of these are at the smart contract level. These are at various parts of the entire stack. And so it's not like, I think in the past, you could have said that this is an incredibly difficult thing to do that wasn't possible before. I think that's getting substantially easier now. And so again, if you're thinking about building something and you're operating in a market that has, laws and regulations, then you do have to account for that and navigate it.
Yeah, I would just add, I totally agree with Nikhil, and I do think that the blockchain analytics that are available in other risk management or cybersecurity, sort of holistic risk management, knowing who you're hiring, making sure you're doing your due diligence, is really important. I also think that there is a distinction, and an important one, that I think sometimes gets conflated when we're talking about Tornado Cash, which is the difference between building privacy preserving technology versus, fully anonymized technology to evade sanctions or evade money laundering. It's really critical that we have these now tools, whether it's zero knowledge proofs or association sets or other types of projects that are being built to help integrate into privacy protocols, to really allow people to, whether it's through digital identity or other ways, to ensure that you're choosing to interact with other good actors. And so, as I mentioned before, just thinking more holistically about risk management as you're building and getting good guidance and getting really nuanced feedback on your product from legal, from regulatory, from compliance team members is really important in thinking about the jurisdiction. I know today we're super focused on the US because Tornado Cash, the sanctions, the criminal case is pending in the US, but there was a companion case in the Netherlands against one of the other co-founders, where he was found guilty under their system of money laundering. And so we live in a very global world, and decentralized technology and code sort of doesn't necessarily have boundaries. And so we have to be very thoughtful around not just the jurisdiction where you're building, but understanding that someone in a different jurisdiction, if it will be open source, if it will be available on the secondary markets, may have it. And so thinking more globally and making sure you're getting guidance earlier rather than later, about what you want to build, who your users are going to be, and just being really thoughtful about it, but not feeling like, oh, we can't take steps to build privacy preserving technology. I think it's really critical that we do.
I'll add one more thing as well, which is that we've talked a lot about it from a regulation and law enforcement standpoint, but I think there's the other part, right, of just from our standpoint of what are we building as developers, founders, builders in the industry. And I think the other thing to consider is, there's a whole sanctions regime and all of those things. But I think there's another one that matters a lot here as well, is that how do we feel ethically, normatively of, large exploit happens on chain, it's from a project that we are friends with, and then that is very clearly being laundered by the exploiter, and we can do nothing about it, right? This is less to do with actually from a regulation sanctions regime. It's more so, how do we feel as developers when we say, oh yeah, our system was used to move the funds of $1 billion from another protocol who we know, right? And I think that's a different question entirely. And that comes down to our values in terms of what we're building for. Are we comfortable with that? Is that something we're okay with? Or is it something that we're like, wait, actually, I'm not okay if you steal from my friends. Our ecosystem that we're building is not okay if you steal from another ecosystem. The best example I can give for Eigenlayer world, right, is privacy protocol launches. And let's say, like, God forbid, there's a hack of Eigen. And let's say $2 billion worth of assets are stolen from Eigen. Now, suddenly that goes into a mixer, and then that's being laundered everywhere else. Like, I don't know how I feel about that. I don't think that it's great that, like, if I built something and I'm like, oh yeah, like this money was stolen from Eigenlayer and all the people who are depositing funds into it, and now there's nothing we can do. It's literally just gone. It's now exited into the void, and it's just there. I think those are the things that I think a lot about as well. It's not just top-down regulation. It's just bottoms up of like, what kind of system do we want to build, and how do we want to actually think about that?
Yeah, so one point which you just raised about the Eigenlayer hack, maybe. Now, question on that there is, let's say, $10 billion in which is locked in Eigenlayer protocol, and 100 plus different AVSs, including Predicate, is getting security from the same stake in various capacity. Let's say one of the AVSs get hacked, right? And that, as you mentioned, that money is being laundered via mixing protocol. Are all the AVSs, all the stakers, all the operators in the entire system is exposed to risk of, hey, you were also charged of money laundering? Is that can be a issue, or only the AVS which is being got caught of the thing is being exposed?
So in this case, the AVS is not, I mean, the exploit happened, right? Now, if the exploit happened and the AVS is not part of it, so in the case of, let's say, Predicate or any of those, the AVS is not responsible for any money laundering. It said the funds were stolen from them / Eigenlayer. Now, let's say you've built a protocol that then the AVS is then facilitating the movement of said stolen funds and profiting from that. That starts changing the conversation a little bit. But in this case, if something happens on Eigenlayer, the AVS is not responsible for money laundering. It's simply that, hey, their economic security is now also compromised, as is the case from Eigenlayer.
The question I brought up is because they are getting the security from the same underlying stake. Like, that's why the question came. But yeah, I think thanks for confirming it. I think the question which Parth asked about which parts developers should be aware of, I think this kind of taking us to the weeds of the thread, Nikhil, which you have written. There are many important parts to it. I'll touch down another developer-focused question, that is the sequences. Now, normies, including me, but understand simply, hey, you build a sequencer to kind of make the LOR or the transactions faster, right? There are less security. There is a faster way to get your transactions being confirmed. You mentioned one thing, specifically sequencers. Feel free to give other examples that if you build a sequencer which is not following some specific laws, you can be sanctioned. Can you just take us through that? And if you can give some other examples like sequencers, let's say solvers or some other tech components which are subject to risk, and what they can kind of do to mitigate that.
Yeah. So I will say, like, this doesn't mean you automatically get sanctioned. It's really just a question around your risk management, your risk tolerance, and what risks you face, and for facilitating certain things. So at the end of the day, if something is happening through the system you built, whether that is a smart contract, a solver, a sequencer, anything, and you're the centralization point of controlling that flow as well as monetizing around it, you face that risk, right? Because you face the risk of facilitating illicit finance because you have a centralized point that you have control over. That's what it comes down to. So I think most projects, many L2s have a centralized sequencer, right? And so they face that risk of, if something happens and they don't do anything about it, but they have the ability to do something about it because they run a centralized sequencer, that is a risk that they face. That is a risk that they face no matter what, unless they take some type of proactive actions or have something in place. all of this is about putting in best effort, right? It's not that it's going to be foolproof. It's not that you've solved all of it at that specific point in time, because these are not always easy things to just purely solve. There's a lot of moving parts there, and you can't be 100%. Even when it comes to compliance and risk management and sanctions regimes, traditional finance also struggles with this. Like, it's not like they're foolproof on anything that they do, but it's about taking best effort at the points of centralization. So in this case to your question, specifically around a sequencer, if you run a centralized sequencer for an L2, you always face this risk. And the risk is heightened if you have a mixer that you as an L2 are amplifying or publicizing while running a centralized sequencer, because now you're both publicizing that as an application, a product on your L2, and you are then able to monetize off of that because you earn sequencer fees, and you are the sole kind of you are the sole accruer of those fees by running the sequencer. So it's a risk that you face.
I just want to amplify what Nikhil said about risk management and good faith efforts. Even in the traditional financial space, it is not zero risk, right? There may always be a risk with any business. And really the question will always be thinking through, where are the points of control or things that a project or a developer can do to decrease the risk of bad actors using the technology to launder funds or commit some sort of crime. But it's really about minimizing that risk and thinking about what are the tools that are available. And we have more of those tools now to try to stop or have time locks, for example, before certain transactions can move through to ensure that you're not moving or knowingly moving illicit proceeds or illicit funds through the protocol. And there may be that the technology hasn't gotten where we ideally would want it to be, and it's about mitigating that risk and also looking at projects like Nikhil's and others who are developing and using the latest technology to look at where we can like close those gaps. The one thing I will say is that I think that we also have to be really careful not to put certain requirements on infrastructure and software that is not appropriate to be there. So for example, if we're talking about block builders or we're talking about base layer neutrality, those are not, if it's critical infrastructure, if it is something that we need, it's the piping for the road on which applications can be built. That is a different conversation about what you need to do or should be required to do under the law than if you're operating a centralized entity or a centralized project where you are really in control, whether it's of the interface, whether it's an application to an on and off ramp. I think those are really different, and we need to be very careful when we're like, I'll speak for myself as the lawyer or like someone who's advising projects, to really understand what is software, what is the infrastructure, what is the communications data that is being transferred, versus someone who is responsible for actually movement of funds and has control over that. And I know we've said the term control a lot, but ultimately that's really critical and something developers should be thinking about early on and as they're building, to really understand what are the points that they can control, what they can't. And then, using the best tools we have, or getting, partnering with projects like Nikhil's or other blockchain analytics who are building these solutions, including for privacy preserving technology and protocols.
Cool. I think we have touched based on most problems about the entire, like the problems which the Tornado Cash saga has brought at this moment. We'll like to kind of deep dive a little bit on Predicate, because as Jane just mentioned, that projects like Predicate is kind of providing us solutions to that. As we all know about my little understanding of Predicate is it's kind of bringing all these policies on chain. Like before a transaction's being executed, you have this set conditions, like might be some for else statements. It is obviously much more complicated, but just as a basic, it's kind of filtering out all this malicious activity and all this. So, like Nikhil, if you can kind of deep dive on Predicate. I know we have deep dive on a dedicated podcast, but if you can give a tail there what Predicate is doing and how exactly Predicate kind of is a useful tool in the current context. Let's say Tornado Cash for the moment.
Yeah. So let's use it in the case of privacy. So for us, privacy is actually, that was one of the things I got first interested in crypto, and how I came into crypto was actually privacy. Because I think privacy is one of the most pressing problems of our time, and how to actually ensure privacy for the transactions we do, the interactions we have, all of those things. So yeah, then turning to Predicate and how this fits within the conversation we've been having is Predicate enables pre-transaction checks for what goes through a contract. So you can actually use Predicate to set those functions saying, I don't want certain assets coming into my privacy system from a public blockchain. An example I can give is, take a privacy protocol. Maybe it's an L1 like Alio, an L2 like Aztec with their portals, or just a privacy system within a chain, and they have a deposit contract. So Predicate can be used to set policies for what transactions can actually go into those deposit contracts itself. And for that, you can use any historical on-chain information or off-chain information for that. So the great part of open permissionless blockchains is actually there's public data, right? Because you can see the transaction history. And you can actually say, look, we don't want certain assets to come in here if the asset is coming in from an exploit, or if the asset is coming in from a sanction entity or someone who's associated to a sanction entity. So Predicate enables those granular level policies. And then how it's executed from a technical fashion is Predicate has a distributed network of operators that issues signatures. So you essentially upgrade that. You have it in that smart contract that transactions can only go through if it receives a signature from the Predicate network. The Predicate network issues signatures if the transaction meets the policy requirement. And the policy here is set by the developer or the organization. So an example I can give that's live is with Alio. So Alio is a privacy blockchain in which they passed a governance proposal. Their ecosystem passed a governance proposal saying that all bridges need to enable some policies for who can bridge into Alio. If not, the validator shouldn't process these transactions. And the reason that they passed this proposal was because they said, hey, look, we don't want to be a hub for stolen funds to basically be the prime source of our liquidity. That's not the world that we want a new L1 to be. So that's why they passed a governance proposal on this. So now all the different bridges use Predicate at the smart contract level for basically pre-transaction checks for what can go through their bridge. And so it's a number of different things. They're checking for flow of funds, rate limit, geolocation. You can see on their proposal, they have, some set of that whole universe of different items.
If we can be a little specific around the Tornado Cash, right? Let's say somebody deploys a mixing protocol, or somebody forks Tornado Cash and does some changes and deploy a mixing protocol of their standard. How Predicate can kind of make it legal? If you can take us to that.
Yeah, so in this case, if you're a developer who's deploying a Tornado Cash, what you can do is you can integrate Predicate for your deposit contract, essentially. And for that deposit contract into your mixer, you can set a policy specifically that you don't want assets originating from sanctioned entities or from exploits to be able to be deposited. For that, you can use something through Predicate. We've built our own social graph system to be able to create your own custom data sets. You could also use through Predicate one of our partners like TRM or Chainalysis or Elliptic. For stolen and exploited data, we also work with Seal ISAC, which is a data sharing consortium that's a nonprofit. So you can use all of their different data and say, hey, transaction is about to be deposited, asset is about to be deposited into this mixer. It cannot be deposited if it's associated with something high risk. Predicate basically enables that check at a smart contract level. So that's how a developer would do it. A developer would come in and say, let me integrate Predicate for my deposit contract here.
Sorry, Nikhil. I also think it's important to focus on, there are different types of categories, right? And I think what Predicate is trying to do is approach it from the best information is with those building their projects and who the users are. And so I think one of the things that a policy engine can, or policy solution can build, is it can be very narrowly tailored to the types of risks that are associated with certain projects being built or what is being deployed, and then ultimately tailored even further by the risk, the percentage, right? So you can tailor if you're looking not just at sanctions, but you want sanctions plus mixer plus fraud, prevention or fraud proofs. Those are the things that I think take that like good faith effort to really manage risk at the risk vectors much better than we're just gonna block every jurisdiction, or we're just gonna block jurisdictions that you don't need to because they're not comprehensively sanctioned. It's really taking more of a narrow, fine-tuned risk approach versus like we're either going to do everything or we're not going to do anything.
I think with compliance, the issue is so diverse, and also diverse in some sense of geopolitically it changes throughout. So someone is sitting in India, let's say a founder, and he is going to build into again privacy space or any space, let's say. Is there enough awareness and education around this? And what should be his approach starting out his company or organization?
I think there can always be more education, honestly. I think we can always, as an industry, do more to educate founders, developers, lawyers. I think it's, everyone in this space. The technology moves so quickly. The solutions that are available now may not have been available 6 months ago. So I think education can always be better. And I think we should have more of these kinds of discussions, and really thoughtful and nuanced. I think the best thing is connecting developers or founders with others who have more experience or can point them to legal counsel or advisors, as to, if they're trying to build something, knowing what the landscape is in their jurisdiction is really important, but also thinking about who their users are going to be or who they want their users to be is also really important.
I'm so sorry, Jane. We lost you for like last couple of minutes. So if you can please repeat.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Just talking about like knowing who your advisors or others in your jurisdiction are really important. But if you know that what you're building, the users are going to be abroad, or you're going to market it or make it available in other jurisdictions, just really important to find points of contact and advisors and really subject matter experts in that field to help you scale as you grow. I always say, like, it's always easier to scale with a project than not have anything in place from a risk management perspective, and then you're really successful and you're trying to basically build as the plane is already flying.
And I think the other thing to add too, right, is like, I'm a founder, and I know like one of the challenges is how do you build quickly? How do you make sure you're going to market? Like, you can't get bogged down with every legal question. No offense, Jane, but you can't get bogged down with every legal question, because then you won't be able to build a product, right? And so like very, very cognizant of that. And I think there's also, I think this is where the education part matters a lot, but I think it's also then looking at what other projects do. Like, one of the great things about what we do in blockchain is that a lot of this is open source, and we're actually really friendly with everyone else. And we're like, here's what we're doing. And for some of these things, it's like, cool, so what is someone else doing? And if they spent the time thinking about it, great. I don't have to go and recreate the entire thought process myself. There's probably lessons I can just take from there and say, okay, cool, this seems reasonable as a starting point. And being able to then pivot or update as needed, as we should always be pivoting and updating as we need, because that is how it works to build a startup. So I think it's taking like initial pieces in place. It doesn't mean you have to have what you as an early stage founder have to do. Does not have to be the same thing as, a late stage project that's raised like $150 million, right? Like, those are two very different things. If you're like a founder who's like, okay, cool, I'm going to launch, I have maybe raised $1 million or $500,000, or even like, I'm just starting out and I haven't raised anything, for example. And it's like, I'm still early. this is why we've been thinking about this from Predicate, is like when it comes to privacy, is like we don't want privacy developers to have to spend an inordinate amount of time going and building a deposit screen and all those things, because that's not their job. Like that's really not where they're going to win. If they're having to build a compliance system, a privacy protocol, that's not how they're going to win. They're going to win by going and saying, how do I actually get adoption of privacy? How do I get this to be used as a product? That's like how I think of the world. And so in that case, it's education and just knowing what tools are there, and then using what makes the most sense, and looking at what others do. And ideally, like in those cases, you're looking at best practices that you can easily implement.
Awesome. I think Nikhil, just as you highlighted, I think especially tech founders or crypto founders, for them delving into legal matters is a very difficult challenge because they are on strict budgets, high tech problems to solve in, and especially things like policies can drag down many months. And there is always a challenge that, hey, you might get some legal notices and you are operating in a very gray area where most people, and in most countries, you don't have an actual clue about the crypto rails. There is no strict policy or strict rails around that. We discussed last time also how Predicate is doing that. So all the people who are listening to that, I'll advise to check that episode. Also, will attach the Predicate docs and the Nikhil's thread, which ignited all this thing. To check that out and to reach out to Nikhil and Jane, obviously, to get your questions sorted. I think this is a very different episode and a unique episode of its kind, especially in Web3 and crypto, because not much policy related stuffs are being discussed. It's either token or it's either tech, which are left and right curve of things. But policy is very important. I think me and Parth are mostly done. Before we kind of sign off, Nikhil, Jane, anything you want to mention, which a builder specifically, like you have mentioned in most things, but anything which we have missed, you guys want to highlight, a builder or a founder building in crypto or in this space wants to keep in mind, and how they can make use of you both from a legal standpoint and also Predicate.
I can kick off. I would just say to all the developers and founders, just build with integrity. Just thinking about how to build with integrity and thinking about it early, I think will go a really long way. And there are some very challenging legal issues still to be decided on how we approach emergent technology. And they're usually pretty nuanced. So getting the right subject matter experts to help, even if it's other founders who are grappling with these issues, is really important. This is a community, and I think we should lean on each other for good advice around that for adoption as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, so what I'll say on my end for closing is a lot of the problems that we talk about are incredibly tricky problems. So our goal at Predicate is that you actually, as a developer, don't have to think as much about this. And that's where, for us, it's creating a library of different policies. So in this case, what I'm basically telling developers here is that, look, like, we know you don't want to think about this. The goal of this and us having this podcast is, and then, for what we're building a Predicate, is actually that you as a developer, let's minimize the amount of time you have to spend thinking about this. We can offload that work for you at a technical level. And we can kind of leverage our existing resources and the fact that other projects have already built policies on Predicate. You don't have to start this from scratch. And the system is already there for you to integrate. So imagine for a privacy developer saying, cool, instead of spending weeks on figuring out how to create a deposit screener and then figuring out your specific granular requirements, well, let's get that done in less than a day, and we'll handle that for you. That's basically what I would tell anyone building in the space, especially building in privacy.
Awesome. Super thanks, Nikhil. Super thanks, Jane, for joining us. And I think we should do more policy-related episodes. I'm sure, as Jen mentioned, in July, there is a hearing of Roman. And there must be some more policy stuff which will be coming up for sure in the space. We can have you again and we can spread more education and we can know your opinions and thoughts around that.
Yeah, that was great. And I think any type of education in terms of compliance would be great, and would like to chat more on this.